But he has the opportunity to show the two plans and try to convince you that one is better than the other.
Does he have a choice now in mandatory cluster versus conventional?
The only choice is asking for a waiver from that.
So it would be similar. Am I right in understanding that we're simply changing mandatory cluster to mandatory conservation? Is that right?
It's mandatory, but it allows a little more flexibility.
No, I understand that, but it's changing cluster to conservation,
yes,
essentially.
Correct.
There are 10 communities in Rhode Island that have adopted conservation development. 2 are pending. There was a hearing last night in Johnson, as a matter of fact. But of the 10 that have already adopted them, 3 are voluntary on the part of the applicant. And there's another 5 or 6 that are mandatory with the out. And then there's a hybrid in North Smithfield for some reason. That I won't go into the details, but my point is, you make that decision, and that's a very important decision. I think I've discussed that as the #1 topic in all these communities, should it be mandatory or voluntary. And I would encourage you to think about that and weigh the pros and cons. I wrote it this way because Lisa and I thought it's a good starting point. Nothing more.
If I could comment on that, I too have a real problem with the mandatory. What I don't have a problem with, and I think we have to consider, is if we have lots of incentives to go the conservation route, so that there's an incentive for the property owner to make the decision on that. I don't have a problem with that. I have a problem with saying to Mr. Property owner, you have 10 acres you want in a 1 acre zoning and you want it divided, but you can't do it the way you want to on your property. I have a problem with that. And I understand it's mandatory now cluster. Just because that's the way it is doesn't mean that's the way it should be. Okay, so if we're going to change things, then we're wide open to all kinds of changes as far as I'm concerned. But if we make it so that we give them incentives to do that, then I'm a lot more comfortable with it than just saying you have to do it that way.
Can I comment on Barry's judgment? I just want to comment on something Barry said earlier. I think Barry is, in his thought process, and this is positive, in his thought process is where the Conservation Commission was a while ago when we first started this process. We were somewhat confused a little bit by what it all meant, and unfortunately it was mixed in with form-based zoning, and we were talking about all those things at the same time. I think there was some confusion about where we were going with this thing and what it really meant. And I think the more you think about it, and I think that's why educational component of this is very important, especially if we have a questionnaire, because as soon as people see the word conservation, some people love it, a lot of people love it, some people don't like it at all. They think it's taking away their rights, their property rights. So I think there's some education that needs to be done on our part, ours being yours and ours, to let people understand what conservation zoning really is and what it can do for the community. And the fact that we're really doing a lot of it right now. And we just don't call it that now, but I think we're doing a lot of it right now. And I think if you were to go out to Beaverdale and walk a parcel of land, you would say to yourself, well, this is a beautiful street, this is a nice wetland, here's the perfect place for the house, and this is where the road should be. You fit it into the environment so that it's more compatible and harmonic with the environment. And I think that's what conservation zoning is, at least in my mind. But I think there's definitely a process, and I agree with you, Barry, there's a process that we need to bring the public up to before we say yay or nay. That's because people just throw up their arms and say this is too much property rights. And I agree, there will be people who think it's property rights taken, but for the common good and to retain what we put in our comp plan, the rural nature of the island, and what we've already done, I think it makes a lot of sense. We need to take it slow in some ways. Carol.
So, Tony, I don't know, maybe you can speak to this, but I know when we were going through this education process and we had Scott Millar from DEM come down, give his presentation on conservation and development and talk to us a little bit about how it plays out. He talked about a number of scenarios that they'd seen happen in other communities where it ended up being a more efficient process and also had substantial monetary savings for the developer. Because it just brought a lot of stuff out in the beginning, talked through it, and then created kind of a more streamlined process in the end. And he had some numbers about, you know, property values afterwards and what the developer made out of it. It made it sound, you know, took away a lot of that fear that you were somehow going to remove value from a property or limit a developer's ability to do something to maximize their use of the property. So that's the kind of information I think maybe would be helpful in that education process and the discussion.
There's two things. There's a study that was done by a graduate student at URI a few years ago that looked at conservation developments and found that the value holds its own. Even though the lots are smaller, the fact that they're located next to open space and they have, you know, preserved views and vistas and common shared open land. So the theory that the town is going to lose tax dollars is not really an accurate one. The lots in the conservation development will sell at or slightly above the value of conventional lots. And secondly, developers in certain cases like the opportunity to go with conservation development because they save money on infrastructure. They don't have to put in as much road, pavement, drainage, all of these utilities. They save money on that. So even though they may spend a little bit more money on design plans and landscape studies and whatnot, they get it back in the end. So there is a pretty well documented body of knowledge already in Rhode Island and certainly elsewhere that it doesn't necessarily, you know, even mandatory conservation development is not going to make people do what they don't want to do. There will always be people who have a different, unique situation, and I believe they should have the right to come in and present their case and ask for, let's say, a conventional. I've never thought like two-lot splits, minor subdivisions, really are suited for conservation development because the open space land will be just a sliver, it'll be worthless. Unless it's a very unique property where a sliver is what you need. But for the most part, conservation development will work in a community where you have a vibrant subdivision market, and every community is different. What will work in Jamestown is not going to work in North Kingstown, and that won't work in Foster. So I try to tailor each of these regulations to the specific needs of the community. That's why we call it draft number 1. Draft number 2, we can throw off a lot of the things that you don't like and work with the things that you do. But I just need, at some point to get some feedback to move it to the point where you're ready to talk to the community, have a survey, public forum, or go right to public hearing.
I guess that goes to the point I was making though, is I don't see any place in Jamestown, or know of any place in Jamestown where you're going to put a 200 lot subdivision that makes sense to turn into a cluster or a conservation lot. There's probably a number of lots that you could have 10 houses or 8 houses or 15 houses in that range. Then I don't know that you gain that much, in a conservation type thing. But if the property owner wants to turn it into a conservation one, fine, let them. But I don't think if that's the situation, we ought to make it mandatory, because I don't think it's going to make that big a difference whether you have 15 1-acre lots or 15 half-acre lots and another 7 acres of conservation land. If there's one place on the island, then that can be done. I just don't see where it's a big deal. So why do we make it mandatory? Let the developer do it the way he wants to.
Can I clarify, Tony? You indicated that it wasn't really mandatory, that a developer, property owner could come in and present both arguments for a traditional subdivision or a conservation subdivision if this went ahead.
The term mandatory is misleading. It should be, whose option is it? Is it the planning board's option or the developer's option? Okay. I'd like to put the planning commission in the driver's seat.